So now that you've learned how to factor quadratics, we're going to add a new wrinkle, because all of the quadratics you've seen before have always just started with a plain old x squared. But you'll notice in this particular expression, it's not x squared, it's negative x squared. And we need to see, how do we deal with that negative? What does that change, if anything? And as it turns out, we actually do have to change something here, because with our previous method, we would just set up two sets of parentheses, and we would start each parenthesis with x, because x times x would give me x squared. But notice it doesn't give me negative x squared, and I need that to be a negative x squared. So you might be thinking, okay, well then I can just make one of these negative. And it's true that if you make one of those negatives, then you will get the negative x squared. The downside is that if you do that, if there's anything in front of one of those x's inside of the parentheses, our rule of saying what adds to the middle number and multiplies to the last number no longer works the same way. And so we need another method. And thankfully, when all that's different is the fact that there's a negative in front of the x squared, there's a very nice, simple way to always deal with that scenario. And that is that we're going to start by factoring a negative out of our expression. And so that means I'm going to put the negative out front of the parentheses, and then I'm just going to divide everything through out by that negative. Now, okay, I'm saying we're dividing by a negative, which really, that doesn't quite seem like it works, right? Technically, what we're doing is we're dividing it by -1. Just remember, though, that we don't need to say -1 times something, because that's just the same as saying, oh, well, that just means it's negative. So we go straight to here. You just have to know the math says that negative is really a -1. All right, so now we're going to pull that negative out of everything. So if I do negative x squared divided by -1, that leaves me with a positive x squared. If I do a positive 12x divided by -1, that will leave me with a negative 12x. And if I take negative 35 and divide it by -1, that gives me a positive 35. Notice that really all I did when I pulled that negative out is I flipped the sign of everything that was left inside, because that's all that dividing by a -1 does. Now that we've done that, the factoring is the same process as what you did before with your quadratics. Just we're now only focused on the quadratic inside of the parentheses. The negative that's hanging out front there, it's just going to keep hanging out front there, even as I break it into the two sets of parentheses. So I'm trying to figure out then what two numbers are going to add to -12 and multiply to a positive 35. Well, notice we're multiplying to a positive, which means that it's either got to be a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative. And we're adding to the -12. The only way to add to a negative then is if both of them are negative. So I know that it's got to be x minus something and x minus something. So I've already ruled out a lot of things there. Now, what multiplies to 35 and adds to -12? I'm thinking 5 and 7. And so it would be a negative x minus 5 times x minus 7. So the first thing we do when we have a negative x squared is we factor that negative out of the whole expression. Then you factor the quadratic that is left inside the parentheses. And it factors just the same way as it normally would. And that negative that was out front, it just carries down and it just stays out front. All right, having seen that process, basically there's no new weird things that are going to crop up along the way. So I just want you to practice it with these remaining problems. We're just going to be working these 4 from here. And so what I'd like you to do is to write down and work out each of these on your own, and so that you know the order that I'm going to be discussing them here in the video is this. So that as I go through this. You can pause and play as you need to so that you have a chance to try the problems first. And it really is essential in learning like this to actually try doing the problem and then watch me do it after you've had a chance to try it. If all you do is sit there and watch it, your brain doesn't hold on to it in the same way. So please do make sure that you're trying each of these first. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in and just start working through each of them. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because the process is hopefully fairly straightforward. All right, so for that first one on the top left, I see that it's a negative x squared. Therefore, that tells me already what my first step is. I need to start by factoring a negative out of everything. Now, factoring out a negative has the effect of just flipping the signs of everything that was in the original. So notice all the numbers are the same, except all the signs have been flipped. Now I'm just going to be looking at that quadratic that's left inside the parentheses, and I'm going to factor that by adding to the middle number and multiplying to the last number. And so I'm going to say, okay, what two numbers add to 11 and multiply to 18? They both have to be positive, and that would be 2 and 9, or 9 and 2 as well, remember. Yes, the order of the parentheses does not matter. I do want the negative out front. I don't want that moving around, but the parentheses could be in either order. So if you wrote it as negative x plus 9 times x plus 2, that's perfectly fine. All right, I'm now going to go to the top right problem. In this one, again, I notice first up that I have a negative x squared. Therefore, the very first thing I do is I factor that negative out of every single term. Now I take a look at the resulting quadratic that's in the parentheses, and that's what I'm going to factor from there. So I'm saying what two numbers add to negative 9 and multiply to negative 36, and I come up with negative 12 and positive 3. And then I have my factored form. Now to the bottom left problem. In this one, once again, I have a negative x squared. Therefore, I start by factoring out the negative. Once I've done that, I'm going to say what two numbers add to a negative 10 and multiply to a positive 24. That ends up being a negative 6 and a negative 4, and that one is now done. And now on to our last problem. Again, I notice I have that negative in front of the x squared. Yes, I have to look for it. Don't try to factor out a negative if there's not one in front of the x squared. So I do have the negative in front of x squared, so I factor out the negative. In this case, I am adding to 1, and I'm multiplying to negative 30, because remember, x is 1x. So that's why I'm adding to 1. And so that combination is 6 and negative 5. And so you can see our factored form there. So it's only one little wrinkle added to our factoring process, but otherwise, it is the same process of factoring a quadratic as what you have previously seen.